Welcome back, you Forge of Empires, the Tide Pod invasion players. Today I wanted to discuss this notion when people will go, I support nationalism for everyone. And I could just be Mr. Obvious. Perhaps what they mean is they just generally are in favor of people being able to preserve their culture and identity, or maybe they're trying to soft pill normies into the idea that nationalism is okay. I respect that. But as far as actual states and political control, economic development is concerned, I think it's pretty obviously a contradictory notion. And we'll evade the United States. I'm kind of bored about discussing our country. I'm going to do like a, kind of merry-go-round across the globe to give you an idea of how much of a problem this is when you're looking at the applied reality of the world. So we can just, hop, skip, and fly to the United Kingdom, where, of course, in 2014, I think it was, Nicola Sturgeon said, "You have bled with Alex Salmond, now bleed with me." They wanted to become independent. And, of course, there was a lot of unified political opposition across the rest of the UK. In particular, the Conservatives and Labour, they got together and was called, Bugger Together, and they wanted to, stay unified. And so that was the campaign, especially right-wing British nationalists, English nationalists in particular, didn't want Scotland to become independent. Just like, of course, historically, Tories have been skeptical about Irish independence, about Welsh independence. They wanted to remain, united as a British kingdom. And really, it's English nationalism that dominates the British Empire, if you study the history. Not saying the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh don't have a role, but generally speaking, England was the one where most of your power brokers emerged. So that's fine, and not a big deal. But then we reach, a couple of years later, and a lot of Conservatives are saying, "Oh, for Queen and country! God save King Charles! We must leave the EU!" And you're like, well, wait a second. So you don't want the Scots or those other kingdoms, or those other regions to have independence, but you want to be independent from the EU. So British nationalism trumps those other smaller nationalisms, but then British nationalism also has to resist essentially the supranational EU. See, again, when you look at how it actually plays out, it's a little bit complicated. Just like you head south and you get to Spain, if you were a Spaniard nationalist, a Carlist, a Alfonsist, a Phalangist, Pedro Sanchezist, and it's okay, but Catalonia, does Catalonia have a role in this world or not? Can they be independent? No, not if you're a Spanish nationalist. You want to keep the country together. Likewise, if you cycle, Israel and Palestine, those can't really coexist. People say a two-state solution, but if you look at, not trying to be a cuck for Palestine, but a lot of the deals that have been given to Palestine, at least the recent ones, maybe not so much those under Billy Boy Clinton or W. Bush, but like the one that Jared Kushner came up with, the Palestinians have this kind of diced up state they would have to be satisfied with. Israel gets a better deal in most of the cases, at least the recent one, as I'm saying. And so, are people going to be satisfied with that? Can you legitimately say you can have both nationalisms at the same time? I would argue you could if people are willing to compromise. But if you believe in true nationalism, preserve and, pursue your destiny, it's probably not going to happen. Let's just be real. Then if you look at a lot of the Polynesian islands and that process of them being introduced to the Europeans, very similar, by the way, to the Native Americans. The Native Americans of the United States probably could have steamrolled the Europeans if they'd been unified. They had numeric superiority, at least at one point, but they were always fighting amongst one another. And so that's why they were divided. And a lot of those Polynesian islands, it was the same thing. So if you're looking at, you're a New Zealand nationalist in the kind of English descended way, right? Do you include the Maori, a lot of whom, by the way, are now mixed race with European? Or do you exclude them? Are they part of New Zealand nationalism? What if you were a Maori nationalist? You can't really coexist if you say, this is our land, you have to leave, or vice versa. And then, of course, with the colonization of Australia, it becomes even more complicated because, the Aborigines, they were so underdeveloped that they were going to be steamrolled by anyone. But of course, if you were saying we need to preserve their culture, their identity, then these people coming and developing things and saying, okay, you either get along or you're going to be, eliminated, which some of them were. Those two ideas of preserving culture and nationalism, they don't meld very well together. So in other words, they were there, various different tribes and whatnot. The Europeans showed up and they're like, that's not a civilization. This is a civilization. And you see their numbers. I think they've gone from like 4,000 to a lot less than that nowadays. And, or was it more than 4,000? I'm not sure what the exact population is now, but it's very microscopic compared to what it was back in the day. And then you go to like South America. This is another instance I talked about before where sometimes our ideas of nationalism conflict violently. So being a Venezuelan socialist nationalist might mean turning a thumb to the United States. Well, if the United States has strategic or resource interests, then they may very well come and say, well, your sovereignty is gone. And that's why a lot of people have seen leaders in South America not to be legitimate because, oh, you're just a puppet of the United States. Just like in other regions, you were a puppet of the Soviet Union. So are you really an independent nationalist if you are basically shilling for American interests, shilling for Chinese interests? And in the case of the rainforest in Ecuador, the people living there, they had a pretty well-established identity, culture, way of life. Well, the multinational oil corporations were like, we're going to develop here. A lot of them are getting sick and being poisoned until Correa came to power, who was more of a left-leaning nationalist. No one cared about them, right? So in the process of a larger country developing, growing its economy, becoming dominant across the globe and across various regions, that nationalism succeeding means it has to crush another form of nationalism elsewhere. Like that culture, that identity, those people can't really preserve themselves if their way of life, their land, whatever, is gradually being wiped out. When I say their land, it's very loose because I believe land is for whoever can actually control it. But if you say you believe in nationalism for everyone, you kind of have to acknowledge basically whichever nationalisms are strong enough economically, militarily, to control and to quash others. Just like, by the way, another great example is Yugoslavia. Are you a catch-all Yugoslav nationalist? Are you a Serbian nationalist? Are you into Greater Serbia or Slovenia, Croatia? You see where the problem comes down. So I'm not against the concept of nationalism, but I think we have to recognize in a lot of parts of the world, for your nationalism to succeed, someone else's has to either play second or third fiddle or just cease to exist and become subservient. So that's just my thoughts on the idea of nationalism for everyone.